She lived isolated in the desert until a fugitive billionaire knocked on her door. Sarah Mitchell woke to desperate knocks on the weathered wooden door of her small adobe house. It was 3 in the morning in the Arizona desert, and in 5 years of living alone in that God-forsaken place, she had never had visitors at that hour. When she opened the door, she found a man around 60 years old, his graying hair disheveled, wearing an expensive suit completely covered in dust. He was trembling and his lips were cracked. "Please," he whispered hoarsely, "I need water." Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her experience with people had been bitter, especially with well-dressed men who promised the world. But there was something in the desperation of his eyes that moved her. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The man staggered into the simple but cozy house. The adobe walls kept the space cool even in the scorching desert heat. Sarah went to the kitchen and brought him a glass of cold water from the clay filter. He drank eagerly, as if he hadn't tasted water in days. "Thank you," he murmured, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "My name is Richard Hamilton." Sarah didn't respond right away. She studied the stranger. The suit, even covered in dust, was clearly expensive. The watch on his wrist was worth more than all the furniture in her home. But there was something in his eyes she recognized, the same pain that had brought her to this forgotten place. "What's a man like you doing here in the middle of nowhere?" she asked, crossing her arms. Richard looked around the modest house. The furniture was sparse but well kept. A bookshelf, some potted plants, old photographs on the wall. Everything breathed simplicity and peace. "I ran away," he said, surprising himself with his own honesty. "I ran from my own 60th birthday party." "Ran away?" Sarah arched her eyebrows. "Why?" Richard ran a hand through his disheveled hair. He still couldn't believe what he'd discovered just hours before. "Because I found out my whole life has been a lie." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, back to the story. Sarah poured him another glass of water. There was something in his voice that intrigued her. She had learned to read people during her years of isolation. It was a matter of survival in the desert. "What kind of lie?" she asked, sitting in the wooden chair across from him. Richard took a deep breath. Telling a stranger seemed easier than facing the truth with people he'd known for decades. "I have a twin brother," he said slowly. "A brother I always believed died at birth." "And he's alive?" "Not just alive. He's lived his whole life here in the desert, just a few miles from where we are now." Richard closed his eyes. "And I only found out last night, when a lawyer showed up at my party with documents proving everything." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Something about the story unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint what. "And you left everything behind to come find this brother?" "No." Richard opened his eyes and looked straight at her. "I came to find his daughter." "My niece." The silence that followed was tense. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. A strange feeling grew in her chest, a mix of fear and curiosity. "And why do you think she's here?" Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Because the lawyer gave me an address. This address." He showed a paper with her own handwriting. "Sarah Mitchell, Hope Ranch, mile 47 on Route 66, Cactus Springs, Arizona." Sarah felt the ground give way beneath her feet. It had been 5 years since she'd moved to that property, inherited from a distant aunt, trying to hide from the world and a family that had hurt her deeply. "How did you get this address?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My brother." Richard swallowed hard. "James Mitchell. He passed away 3 years ago, but before he left he gave instructions that if I ever came looking for him, I should find his daughter." The glass slipped from Sarah's hands and shattered on the concrete floor. James Mitchell, her father. The man she had abandoned in life over misunderstandings about money and inheritance. The man who had tried to reconcile with her for years, until pride had kept them both from backing down. "No," she whispered, standing abruptly. "This can't be true." Richard looked at the shards on the floor and then at the young woman's pale face. Now that he studied her more closely, he could see familiar features. The almond-shaped brown eyes, the shape of her nose, the high forehead. It was like looking at a feminine version of his brother. "You're Sarah, aren't you?" he asked softly. "James's daughter." Sarah leaned against the wall, her legs weakening. 5 years running from her own family, 5 years trying to forget the pain of losing her father without reconciling, and now here was an uncle she hadn't even known existed. "How can I believe you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Anyone could make up a story like this." Richard stood slowly and pulled out his wallet. From it, he took an old photograph, yellowed with time. "This was taken at your christening," he said, handing her the picture. "James and I were 6 months old. Our mother always carried this photo in her purse." Sarah took the photograph with shaking hands. In the image, 2 identical babies wore white christening gowns. A woman smiled in the background, and a mustached man held both infants. "My God," she murmured. "You really are identical twins." "There's more," Richard continued, removing a small golden locket from his neck. "James and I were given these lockets at our christening. Each kept his own. When my adoptive parents took me to New York City, I held on to mine. The lawyer told me James always wore his." Sarah stared at the locket. It was identical to the one her father had always worn, the same one she'd kept as a memento after he was gone. "I need time to process all this," she said, stepping back. "Of course, I understand completely." Richard put away the photo and the locket. "I can sleep in the car tonight and come back tomorrow." "No," Sarah interrupted. "You're exhausted and dehydrated. You can stay in the guest room tonight. We'll talk more tomorrow." She led the way to a small room at the back of the house. Richard nodded in thanks and headed inside. Sarah stood alone in the living room, staring at the broken glass on the floor. Her life had just been turned upside down again. She spent the night awake, pacing the house and trying to make sense of it all. Could it be true? Did she really have an uncle? And if it was true, why had her father never mentioned having a twin brother? As the sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink, Sarah went to check on her unexpected guest. When she opened the bedroom door, she found Richard collapsed on the floor. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed, rushing to help him. He was conscious but very weak. His skin was pale, and he was drenched in sweat. "Sorry," he murmured. "Think I overdid it. Haven't eaten or drunk properly in 2 days." Sarah helped him up and led him to the kitchen. She prepared strong coffee with homemade bread and scrambled eggs. "You need to eat something," she said, placing the plate in front of him. As Richard ate, Sarah watched him discreetly. Now in the daylight, she could better see the features that connected him to her father, the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, even the way he held his fork. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. If you always believed your brother had passed away, how were you raised?" Richard set his fork down on the plate and looked out the window at the vast, arid expanse of the desert. "I was adopted by a wealthy family in New York City when I was just a few months old. I grew up believing I was an only child, that my birth parents had died in an accident." He paused. "I built a business empire, accumulated a fortune I don't even know the exact size of, but I always felt like something was missing. And now you've found out what it was. I discovered I had a brother who lived his whole life here, who got married, had a daughter, worked honestly as a mechanic in town." Richard looked directly at Sarah, and that this daughter ran away from home at 25 because of family disagreements. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. It was true. She had left her father's house at 25, after a terrible fight over her grandfather's inheritance. There had been harsh words on both sides, accusations of financial interest, wounded pride. "How do you know this?" "Because James searched for you for years. He hired detectives, put ads in newspapers. He never gave up on finding you." "That's not true," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He left a letter." Richard pulled another envelope from his pocket. "A letter for you, in case I ever found you." Sarah looked at the envelope with her own name handwritten on it. "To Sarah, my beloved daughter." It was her father's handwriting, no doubt about it. She took the letter with trembling hands and opened it slowly. "My beloved daughter, if you're reading this letter, it means my brother Richard has finally found me and reached you. I know you must be confused and angry, but I need you to know the truth about our family. Richard and I were separated when we were babies. Our birth parents couldn't afford to raise 2 children, so he was given up for adoption to a wealthy family in New York City. I stayed here in the desert with our grandparents. My whole life, I tried to find him, but I never had the means or the knowledge to do so. When you fought with me over your grandfather's inheritance and left, I realized I was repeating the same tragedy as my family, losing the people I love most because of pride and misunderstandings. I hired a lawyer and left instructions so that if Richard ever came looking for me, he'd know where to find you. I hope the 2 of you can have the family I never managed to reunite. Forgive this stubborn old man, my daughter. I love you more than anything in this world. Your father, James. Sarah couldn't hold back her tears. She cried as she hadn't in years, releasing all the pain she'd carried through 5 years of isolation and guilt. Richard hesitantly reached out and touched her shoulder. He loved you very much, he said softly. In his last months, he spoke only of you. His last months? Sarah looked at him through her tears. You met him? Not directly, but the lawyer told me James had been very ill toward the end. He had heart problems. That's when he decided to look for me through a private investigation firm. Sarah felt another wave of grief. Her father had spent his final moments trying to bring their family together, while she had lived isolated in the desert, nursing her grudges. I should have gone back, she sobbed. I should have swallowed my pride and gone back home. And I should have looked for him sooner, said Richard. We have a lot in common, Sarah. Both of us let pride separate us from the people we love. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing, they fell silent for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts and regrets. Why did you run away from your birthday party? Sarah asked, wiping her eyes. Richard sighed deeply. Because I realized I was celebrating 60 years of an empty life. 500 guests at the party, but not a single true friend. A company worth billions, but one that never brought me real happiness. He looked around Sarah's simple adobe house, and then a lawyer shows up telling me I had a brother who lived a simple life here in the desert, who was truly happy. How do you know he was happy? Because he left this house to you, because even when hurt, he never gave up trying to find you, because he had the courage to love, even knowing he might get hurt. Richard paused. I never had that courage. I never married, never had children. I always thought relationships were an unnecessary risk for business. Sarah understood that both of them had been wounded by life, each in their own way. He had chosen emotional isolation through obsessive work. She had chosen physical isolation by fleeing to the desert. And now, what do you plan to do? I don't know, Richard admitted. For the first time in my life, I don't have a business plan, a strategy, or a goal to reach. All I know is I don't want to go back to that empty life. Just then, they heard the sound of an engine approaching. Sarah stood and looked out the window. It was Mrs. Dorothy, her nearest neighbor, who lived about 20 miles away. It's strange for Dorothy to show up this early, Sarah murmured. Mrs. Dorothy was a 70-year-old woman, thin and energetic, who knew the desert like no one else. She had been one of the few people Sarah had allowed into her life during her years of isolation. Sarah, dear, Mrs. Dorothy called as soon as she stepped out of her old pickup truck. You need to get ready. There's a sandstorm coming from the southwest. Sarah went out to greet her, followed by Richard. A sandstorm? He asked, concerned. Yes, son, said Mrs. Dorothy, eyeing the well-dressed man curiously. From what I saw in the sky this morning, it's going to be a big one. You've got about 6 hours to prepare. Richard, this is my uncle, Sarah said, surprising herself with how naturally she acknowledged the relation. Mrs. Dorothy raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. She had learned to respect Sarah's privacy. Pleasure to meet you, young man. She shook Richard's hand. You two will have to hunker down here for at least 2 days. Sarah, do you have enough supplies? I do, Mrs. Dorothy, and the generator's working. Good. I'd better hurry back home before it gets bad. Mrs. Dorothy headed back to her truck. Take care, you two. As soon as she left, Sarah began preparing for the storm. She boarded up all the windows, checked the water supply, tested the generator, and organized candles and flashlights. Richard helped as best he could, still adjusting to life without central air conditioning and staff to handle everything. "Are these storms dangerous?" he asked while helping screw a board over the living room window. "They can be. The sand gets so thick in the air you can't even see your own hand, and the wind can knock down trees and power lines." Sarah tightened the last screw. "But this house is solid. My father—" She hesitated. "James built it to withstand anything the desert could throw at it." It was the first time she'd spoken of her father without bitterness in her voice. Richard noticed and smiled faintly. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sky began to darken on the horizon. A strong wind started blowing, kicking up swirling dust devils. "It's starting already," said Sarah, closing the last window. "Now, we just wait it out." They settled in the living room with lit candles and a thermos of coffee. The wind outside grew stronger, and they could already hear the sand hitting the walls of the house. "Sarah," Richard broke the silence, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Go ahead." "Why did you choose to live isolated out here? I mean, besides the fight with your father?" Sarah stayed quiet for a moment, listening to the wind howling outside. "Because I got tired of people who only wanted something from me," she finally said. "Boyfriends who were interested in my grandfather's inheritance. Friends who only showed up when they needed a favor. A family that saw me as a pawn in their games." "And your father? Was he like that too?" "No, he genuinely loved me, but I was so hurt by everyone else that I couldn't see it at the time." Sarah sighed. "When he tried to explain the inheritance to me, how my grandfather wanted to divide the land among his grandchildren, I took it as just another attempt to control my life. And it wasn't? No, it was love. He wanted to make sure I had financial stability while still respecting my grandfather's wishes." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes again. "I was a stubborn fool." "We've both been stubborn fools," Richard said. "I could have searched for my biological family decades ago, but I was so focused on building my empire that I didn't want emotional complications in my life." The wind outside was now violent. The whole house trembled slightly, but the solid adobe walls held firm. "And now?" Sarah asked. "What will you do when the storm passes?" "Honestly, I have no idea." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "I've got a company to run, commitments, responsibilities. But for the first time in my life, none of that seems important." "You could sell the company." "I could, but then what? What would I do with all that money?" Sarah glanced around her simple but cozy home. "You could help people, create opportunities, make a real difference in the world." "Like what?" "I don't know. Maybe build schools in the desert, or a hospital in the region, or start a program to help families who've been separated find each other again." Richard looked at his niece with admiration. Despite her youth and the wounds life had given her, she had a wisdom he'd long lost in the world of business. "Would you be serious about that?" he asked. "About what?" "About helping me do something useful with the money." Sarah looked at him surprised. "Are you serious?" "Completely. That is, if you'd be willing to leave this isolation and work with me." Before Sarah could answer, the lights flickered and went out. The generator had stopped. "Darn it," she muttered, getting up to grab a flashlight. Sand must have gotten into the engine. They were left illuminated only by candles as the storm raged outside. It was a strangely intimate setting for two people who'd known each other for less than 24 hours. "Sarah," Richard said softly, "can I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" "Of course." "I'm sick." Sarah's heart raced. "Sick how?" "Cancer. Pancreatic." Richard looked down at his hands. "The doctors gave me 6 months to a year." "Oh my God." Sarah covered her mouth. "Is that why you ran from the party?" "Partly. I found out 3 months ago. Since then, I've been thinking a lot about what really matters in life." He looked at her. "And when the lawyer showed up yesterday with the news about James and about you, I realized I was wasting the time I have left." Sarah felt tears welling up again. She had just found the only family she had left in the world, and now she was learning she might lose him soon. "Is there treatment?" "There is, but it's very aggressive and doesn't guarantee anything. The doctors said I could try chemotherapy and extend my life by a few months, or I could accept the prognosis and try to live those months with quality." "And what have you decided?" I haven't decided yet, but meeting you is making me rethink everything." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm. Sarah was processing all the revelations of the past few days. An uncle she never knew existed, a father who had tried to reunite the family before passing, and now the possibility of losing someone dear to her again. "Richard," she finally said, "if you decide to go through with the treatment, I'd like to take care of you." He looked at her surprised. "You'd do that, even though we've known each other for such a short time. You're my family. And I've already wasted too much time running from the people I love." Richard felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades. It was as if a part of him that had long been dead was coming back to life. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more to me than you can imagine." The storm lasted all night. They talked late into the evening, sharing stories about James, about their lives, about dreams lost and found. Sarah discovered that Richard had a dry sense of humor that reminded her so much of her father's. Richard learned that Sarah had a practical intelligence and a natural generosity that impressed him. When the sun rose, the storm had passed. They opened the doors of the house and found a transformed landscape. Richard's car was completely buried in sand. "Well," he said, looking at the buried vehicle, "seems like I'll be staying here longer than I planned." "Don't worry," Sarah said, smiling. "Mrs. Dorothy will come check on us. She always does after storms. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we'll get to know each other better, and maybe we can start planning what to do with your fortune." Richard laughed for the first time in months, a genuine laugh, free of the tension and stress he'd carried for so long. "You know what, Sarah? I think this was the best storm of my life." In the days that followed, as they waited for rescue, Sarah and Richard developed a simple but fulfilling routine. She taught him about life in the desert, how to conserve water, which plants were edible, how to read the signs of the weather. He shared stories about the business world, about traveling the globe, about the loneliness of having so much money but so few true friends. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. During one of these conversations, Sarah showed Richard an old trunk she'd found in the attic when she moved in. She'd never had the courage to open it, suspecting it held her father's personal belongings. "Maybe it's time to open it," Richard suggested gently. Together, they brought the heavy trunk down and placed it in the living room. Sarah took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, documents, letters, and small personal items. On top was a large envelope with Sarah's name handwritten on it. "Another letter?" she asked, surprised. She opened the envelope and found several handwritten pages, along with official documents. "My dear daughter, if you're reading this, it means you've returned home and found this chest. I always hoped that one day I'd have the courage to overcome our mutual pride, and we'd talk again. Since that didn't happen, I'm leaving here the truth about our family and the decisions I made. Your grandfather's inheritance wasn't the reason for our fight, Sarah. It was just an excuse. The truth is, I was afraid to tell you about my twin brother because I thought you'd judge me for never trying to find him. You see, my daughter, I always knew Richard was alive. Our mother told me the truth before she passed, but I was young, proud, and believed he had chosen the wealthy family over staying with us. What foolishness. He was just a baby. For years I wanted to search for him, but my pride always got in the way. How could a simple mechanic from the desert approach a successful businessman from New York City? What could I possibly offer? When you fought with me about the inheritance, I realized I was repeating the same mistakes. I was letting pride destroy another family relationship. That's when I decided to act. I hired a lawyer and left instructions so that when Richard came looking for me, and I was certain he would one day, he'd know how to find you. I hope the two of you can have the united family I never managed to build." Sarah stopped reading, too emotional to continue. Richard gently took the pages from her hands and continued reading aloud. "Sarah, in the rest of this chest, you'll find documents about properties I bought over the years. There aren't many, but they're enough to ensure your stability. More importantly, you'll also find photographs and mementos of our family. There's a special photo I always carried with me. It's of me and Richard when we were 5 years old, just months before we were separated. We looked so alike, even our own mother sometimes couldn't tell us apart. My daughter, forgive this stubborn old man. Forgive my brother too, for I'm certain he, like me, carried the pain of separation his whole life. And please, don't let pride divide you as it did us. I love you both more than you can imagine. James Mitchell. Richard finished reading with a choked voice. They sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing James's words. Sarah rummaged through the chest and found the mentioned photograph. The resemblance between the two boys was truly striking. They were playing with wooden toy horses, smiling and carefree. He was right, said Richard, looking at the photo. I carried that pain my whole life. I always felt something was missing, but I never understood what. And now? Now I know. It was family. It was belonging. It was having someone who cared about me for who I am, not what I own. Sarah pulled out more photographs from the chest. There were images of James at different stages of life. A young mechanic marrying her mother, celebrating Sarah's birth, working in the shop. He seems to have been happy, Richard observed. He was. My father was a simple man, but genuinely happy. Until I turned 25 and complicated everything with my paranoia and insecurities. You were young, Sarah. Young people make mistakes. And 60-year-old men do too, she said, looking at him with a sad smile. They continued exploring the chest's contents. There were property documents, as James had mentioned, small plots of land in the area, a little house in town, some bank investments. Nothing extravagant, but enough to ensure a comfortable life. Your father was a prudent man, Richard noted. He made sure to secure your future. He always did. Even when I was little, he always thought ahead. At the bottom of the chest, Sarah found a small blue velvet box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small stone. This was my mother's engagement ring, she said, emotional. Dad always said he'd save it for when I got married. Richard watched his niece hold the ring carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. You never married? I dated a few times, but nothing serious. After the fight with Dad, I completely shut myself off from relationships. Sarah put the ring back in the little box. And you? Never been interested in anyone? A few times, but I always thought marriage and kids would get in the way of my career. Foolish, isn't it? I spent my whole life building an empire just to have no one to leave it to. At that moment, they heard the sound of an engine approaching. It was Mrs. Dorothy, just as Sarah had predicted. Sarah, Richard, she called out, walking toward the house. Are you both all right? They stepped outside to greet her. Mrs. Dorothy had brought two men with a tow truck. I brought the boys to dig out your uncle's car, she said, and some extra groceries, since I figured you must have eaten everything in the house. Actually, no, Sarah said, smiling. We talked so much we forgot to eat properly. Mrs. Dorothy looked from one to the other with knowing eyes. She hadn't missed that they both seemed different, less tense, lighter. Well, that's how it goes when family reunites, she teased. Always so much to catch up on. The men worked for a few hours to dig out Richard's car. When they finally freed it, the vehicle was covered in scratches but still running. Thanks, everyone, Richard said, paying them generously. So now what? Mrs. Dorothy asked. Are you leaving, Richard? He glanced at Sarah, then at the simple house that had become an unexpected refuge. Actually, I was thinking of staying a few more days. If Sarah doesn't mind, of course. Of course I don't mind, Sarah said quickly. I mean, we still have a lot to talk about, and plans to make. Mrs. Dorothy smiled knowingly. Plans. Richard wants to use part of his fortune to help people in the area, Sarah explained. We've been brainstorming possibilities. What kind of possibilities? A hospital in town, Richard said. Or maybe trade schools to teach useful skills to young people here. Or a program to help families who've lost touch reconnect, Sarah added. Mrs. Dorothy looked at them approvingly. Those are good ideas. This area needs more opportunities for the young. So many leave for the big cities and never come back. Exactly, Richard said. We want to give them reasons to stay, or at least to return after they finish their studies. After Mrs. Dorothy and the men left, Sarah and Richard went back inside. The discovery of the chest had changed something between them. Now they felt truly connected, not just by blood, but by a shared family history. Richard, Sarah said, pouring coffee for them both. Can I make a suggestion? Of course. What if we visited the town where my dad lived? The house, the shop where he worked. Maybe it'd help you feel more connected to our family's story. Richard considered it. The idea of seeing the places his brother had lived appealed to him, but it also made him nervous. Do you think I'd be welcome? I mean, a rich stranger suddenly showing up claiming to be James's brother? My dad was well loved in town. He had many friends. I'm sure they'd want to meet his brother. And you? Wouldn't it be hard going back after so long? Sarah thought for a moment. It would. But I think it's time to face the past. And besides, if we're really going to do something to help the region, we need to better understand the people's needs. They decided to go the next day. Sarah called Mrs. Dorothy and asked her to let some people in town know they would be visiting. Don't worry, dear, said Mrs. Dorothy. I'll let the folks at the workshop where your father worked know. They'll be so happy to see you again. The next morning, they set off for Cactus Springs. It was a small town, typical of rural Arizona, with simple houses and cobblestone streets. The heat was intense, but there was a vibrant energy in the movement of the people. Their first stop was the auto shop where James had worked for over 30 years. The current owner, Mr. Benjamin, was a 60-year-old man who had been James's apprentice. "Sarah," he exclaimed, hugging her warmly. "Look how you've grown. And this must be Richard, James's brother." "Is that really true?" asked one of the younger mechanics. "James had a twin brother?" "He did," said Richard, still getting used to the idea. "We were separated as babies and only just found each other through Sarah. James always said he felt like a part of him was missing," said Mr. Benjamin. "Now it makes sense." They showed Richard the workbench where James used to work, the tools he used, old photos of the shop. There was a picture of James holding Sarah in his arms when she was about 5. "He was so proud of this girl," said Mr. Benjamin, "always showed the pictures to everyone." Sarah felt a lump in her throat hearing this. She had forgotten just how much her father had loved her. "Mr. Benjamin," said Richard, "can I ask you something? What was my brother like? As a person, I mean." "James was the most honest man I ever knew," Mr. Benjamin replied without hesitation. "Hardworking, dependable, always willing to help anyone in need. When someone couldn't afford car repairs, he'd do it anyway. Just ask them to bring some eggs or a chicken when they could." "Did he ever talk about me?" "Sometimes. Especially in his later years. He said he had a brother out there somewhere and that one day he'd find him." Mr. Benjamin looked at Sarah. "After you left, he seemed a little lost." That's when he started talking more about his brother. Richard and Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance. James had lost his daughter and then began searching for his brother. It was as if he'd been trying to keep the family together in some way. They also visited the house where James had lived. It was a simple, well-kept little home with a small garden out front. The neighbor who looked after the property, Mrs. Catherine, welcomed them warmly. "Sarah, my dear," she exclaimed, "your father would have been so happy to know you came back." The house was exactly as Sarah remembered. The modest but well-maintained furniture, the photographs on the wall, the bookshelf filled with auto manuals and a few novels. "Can I show you something?" said Mrs. Catherine. "James asked me to keep a few things in case Sarah ever came back." She led them to James's room and opened a closet. Inside was a box with more photographs, letters, and some personal items. "He set all this aside in his last few months," Mrs. Catherine explained. "Said he wanted to make sure Sarah would have the family memories." Among the items was the twin locket to the one Richard wore. When he saw it, he couldn't hold back his emotions. "May I?" he asked, picking up the locket. "Of course," said Sarah. "I think Dad would have wanted you to have it." Richard placed the locket around his neck next to his own. It was as if a part of him that had been missing for 60 years had finally returned to its place. They spent the rest of the day visiting the important places from Sarah's childhood and meeting people who had been close to James. Each conversation revealed more about the man he had been, generous, hard-working, beloved by everyone who knew him. By late afternoon, they sat in the town's central square, watching people come and go. "You know something?" Richard said. "I'm starting to understand why James chose to stay here instead of looking for me in New York City." "Why?" "Because he had something I never did, a community, people who truly cared about him. Richard watched a group of children playing in the square. In New York, I have employees, business partners, acquaintances, but not a single person who would care if I lost all my money. Now you do, Sarah said simply. Richard looked at her with gratitude. That's true. Now I do. They returned to Sarah's house by the end of the day, but something had changed. The visit to town had strengthened their bond and given Richard a new perspective on what truly mattered in life. That evening, they sat on the porch of the house, gazing at the starry desert sky. The absence of light pollution made thousands of stars visible with a clarity impossible in the big city. Sarah, Richard said, I've made a decision. What decision? I'm going through with the treatment. Sarah turned to look at him, surprised. Are you sure? I am. Because now I have something worth fighting for. I have a family. And I have plans to carry out with you. What about the company? I'll hand over management to my vice president. He's capable and honest. The company will be in good hands. Richard paused. And I'll use most of the profits to create the foundation we discussed. What kind of foundation? One that helps separated families reunite, that builds schools and hospitals in underserved areas, that gives opportunities to young people who would otherwise have to leave their communities. Sarah's heart raced at the possibility of truly making a difference in people's lives. And could I help run this foundation? Could you? Sarah, I was counting on it. You know this region. You understand people's needs. I have the money, but you have the knowledge and the heart. But I don't have experience managing foundations. And I don't have experience living a life that truly matters. We'll learn together. In the moments that followed, they began outlining the first plans for the foundation. It would be called the James Mitchell Foundation, in honor of the man who had brought their family together even after his passing. The first center would be built right there in Cactus Springs, a facility combining basic healthcare services with vocational training for young people. There would also be a department dedicated to helping families reunite, using technology and networks to locate lost relatives. You know what excites me most about this project, Sarah said. What? That we'll help others avoid the mistakes our family made. We'll help families come together before it's too late. Exactly, Richard said, looking up at the starry sky. James would be proud. He would. In the weeks that followed, Richard began chemotherapy treatment at a private hospital in Phoenix. Sarah accompanied him to every session, caring for him with the devotion of a daughter. The treatment was aggressive and draining, but Richard faced each session with renewed determination. Between treatments, they worked on the foundation's plans. Sarah had temporarily moved to Phoenix to be closer to the hospital, but kept the desert house as the foundation's base of operations. How are you feeling today? She asked one morning, while they waited for the oncologist's appointment. Better, said Richard. And it was true. Despite the side effects of chemotherapy, he felt more alive than ever before. Having a purpose makes all the difference. The doctor had encouraging news. The tumor had shrunk significantly, and the tests showed promising signs. Of course, it's still too early to celebrate, said the doctor, but the results are much better than I expected. And what do you attribute this to? Asked Sarah. Well, the treatment is working, obviously, but I always tell my patients that emotional state makes a huge difference. Patients who have something to fight for, who feel loved and supported, respond better to treatment. Richard squeezed Sarah's hand. He knew exactly why he was improving. Meanwhile, the foundation's work was progressing quickly. Richard had hired a team of lawyers and administrators to handle the bureaucratic side, while he and Sarah focused on strategy and operations. The first center was being built in Cactus Springs, on land donated by the city. It would be a modern building, but one that respected local architecture, with reinforced adobe walls and a roof designed for natural ventilation. It's going to be beautiful, said Sarah, looking at the project model, and perfectly adapted to the region's climate. Your father would be amazed to see how his daughter has become a businesswoman, Richard teased. And he'd be amazed to see how his brother has become a person. They laughed together. Richard had changed a lot in recent months, not just physically due to the treatment, but especially in his personality. He was more relaxed, kinder, more present. "Sarah," he said one day while reviewing the center's plans, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy? I mean, with this new life we're building?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "You know, I spent 5 years thinking happiness was in isolation, that if I protected myself from people, I couldn't get hurt." She looked at him. "But I've learned that true happiness is in connecting with people, even if it means risking getting hurt." "And are you afraid of getting hurt again?" "I am, especially of losing you." Sarah's voice trembled. "I just found my family and I might lose it again." Richard stood up and hugged his niece. "Sarah, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. And even if something happens to me, you won't be alone again. You have Mrs. Dorothy, your father's friends, an entire community that cares about you." "It's not the same." "No, it's not. But it's a support network. And besides, we're building a foundation that will last for generations. A part of us will keep helping people long after we're gone." Sarah pulled back from the hug and looked into her uncle's eyes. "Promise me you'll fight? That you'll do everything you can to get better?" "I promise. And do you promise you'll keep the foundation's work going no matter what happens to me?" "I promise." They sealed the agreement with another hug. 6 months later, the James Mitchell Center opened in Cactus Springs. It was a day of celebration for the whole town. People came from nearby communities to see the facilities. The center had a medical clinic with modern equipment, classrooms for vocational courses, a community library, and a special department dedicated to reuniting families. "I can't believe we managed to do all this in such a short time," said Sarah, watching people explore the center. "When you have motivation and resources, things happen quickly," Richard replied. He was doing much better. The latest tests showed the tumor had shrunk dramatically. The doctors spoke of remission. "Richard," said Mr. Benjamin, approaching them, "your brother would be so proud. This is going to change so many lives." "I hope so, Mr. Benjamin." "Don't just hope, be certain. My grandson is going to take the electronics technician course here. Before, he'd have had to go to Phoenix, and we couldn't afford that." It was exactly this kind of comment that made all the effort worthwhile. During the inauguration ceremony, Sarah gave an emotional speech. "This center is more than just a building," she told the gathered crowd. "It's a symbol that it's never too late to start over, to reconnect with the people we love, to make a difference in others' lives. My father, James Mitchell, always believed in the strength of community. He knew that when people come together, they can overcome any hardship. This center is an extension of that dream." The audience applauded warmly. Deep down, Richard felt his eyes welling up with emotion. After the ceremony, they returned to the house in the desert. There was something symbolic about going back to where it all began. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said as she prepared dinner. "What?" "A year ago, I was completely isolated, convinced I didn't need anyone. And now I can't imagine my life without you, without Mrs. Dorothy, without everyone in town, without the foundation's work. And a year ago, I was convinced relationships were a waste of time and money." Richard laughed. "Look where we are now. Do you think Daddy planned all this?" "How so?" "He left instructions for you to find me. Do you think he knew we both needed each other?" Richard considered the question. "You know, Sarah, I think James was wiser than any of us realized. He understood that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to care for one another, and that it's never too late to make amends." "Exactly." They ate dinner in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the gentle desert wind rustled through the trees. "Richard," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I used to have nightmares about being alone in the world, about no one truly caring for me. And now? Now I dream about all the families we'll help reunite, about all the young people who'll have opportunities they never would have had before, about all the lives we'll touch through the foundation." Richard smiled. "You know, Sarah, I used to dream of being the richest man in the country, of building the biggest business empire." He paused. "Now I dream of being the best uncle I can be and leaving a legacy that truly matters. I think we've already done both. Months later, the James Mitchell Foundation had expanded to 3 cities in the region. Each center followed the same model, combining healthcare services, technical education, and family reunification. The family reunification program had been particularly successful. Using modern technology and a network of volunteers, they had already helped dozens of families reconnect. "Look at this report," Sarah said, showing Richard the statistics. "We've helped 43 families reunite. 43. And look at this one," he replied, handing her another document. 300 young people have graduated from our technical courses, and 80% found jobs in the region. That means they didn't have to leave their families to find opportunities. Exactly. We're breaking the cycle of forced migration. It was an especially hot afternoon, and they were working on the porch, enjoying the shade of the trees Sarah had planted years before. "Richard," she said, setting the papers down, "can I ask you something personal?" "Always." "Do you miss your old life? From the company, from power, from all that hustle and bustle?" Richard reflected for a moment, gazing at the serene desert landscape. "You know, Sarah, there's a difference between being busy and actually accomplishing something. Before, I was always busy, always rushing, always working, but deep down, I wasn't building anything that truly mattered. And now? Now I wake up every day knowing that what we're doing here will last much longer than any company. We're changing people's lives in a lasting way. And that doesn't bore you, after such a hectic life?" "On the contrary, for the first time in my life, I feel truly useful." He looked at her. "And for the first time in my life, I feel truly loved." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. "I love you too, Uncle Richard, and I love you as if you were my own daughter." They sat in silence for a few minutes, savoring the moment and the depth of the connection they'd built. "You know what makes me happiest?" said Sarah. "What?" "Knowing we're honoring Daddy's memory in the best way possible. I'm sure he'd be proud to see how we've become a real family and how we've turned our pain into something positive for others." "Exactly." Just then, Mrs. Dorothy arrived in her pickup truck, as she did at least twice a week. "How's it going, my dears?" she called out, stepping down from the vehicle. "How's the foundation's work coming along?" "Very well, Mrs. Dorothy," Sarah replied. "Another report of a successful family reunion is on its way." "How wonderful!" Mrs. Dorothy climbed onto the porch and sat with them. "You know you're the talk of the whole region, right?" "How so?" asked Richard. "Everyone's talking about the billionaire who left big city life behind to care for his niece and help the poor in the desert, and about the young woman who came out of isolation to change the world." Sarah and Richard laughed. "It's not quite like that, Mrs. Dorothy," said Sarah. "We're the ones who saved each other." "And through James's wisdom, who managed to bring the family together even after he was gone," Richard added. "Oh, but that's how it works," said Mrs. Dorothy, shaking her head. "The best things in life happen when we stop chasing them and let them come naturally." "How so?" "You two spent years running away. You from family, Richard, and you from people, Sarah. And in the end, it was exactly when you stopped running that you found what you truly needed." Mrs. Dorothy's words echoed in both their minds. It was true. Richard had fled the birthday party and found a family. Sarah had stopped running from people and found a purpose. "Mrs. Dorothy is right," said Richard after she left. "Life has a strange irony, doesn't it?" "It does, but I think that irony only works when we're ready for it." "How so?" "If you'd shown up at my door 2 years ago, I probably would have sent you away. And if I'd tried to look for you 2 years ago, you probably wouldn't have paid any attention." "That's true. We needed to hit rock bottom first, me with my illness and you with total isolation, to understand what really matters." "Exactly." They returned to work, but with a new perspective on the path that had brought them there. A year after the first center opened, they received an unexpected visit. A man around 40 showed up at the house, accompanied by a woman of similar age and 2 children. "Excuse me," the man said timidly. "Are you Sarah and Richard from the James Mitchell Foundation?" "Yes, we are," Sarah replied. "How can we help you?" "My name is Michael, and this is my wife, Lisa." The man swallowed hard, emotional. "You saved our family." "How so?" 5 years ago, my sister disappeared after a family fight. No one knew where she was or even if she was alive." Michael looked at the children. My kids never really got to know their aunt properly. And then? Then we reached out to your center in Cactus Springs. The family reunification team managed to locate my sister in just 3 weeks. She was living in San Diego, working as a nurse. How wonderful, Sarah exclaimed. And last weekend, we had our first family reunion in 5 years. Lisa had tears in her eyes. It was the happiest day of my life. And we came here to thank you in person, Michael said, because you can't imagine what it means to have the family together again. Richard and Sarah exchanged a glance, deeply moved. Actually, we know exactly what it means, Richard said, because we went through the same experience. We were also a separated family, Sarah explained. And it was through reunification that we understood the importance of helping other families experience the same. Michael and Lisa spent a few minutes talking with them, sharing details of the family reunion and their plans to stay in touch. One last thing, Michael said before leaving. The center's team told us that the two of you also reunited not long ago. Is that true? It's true, Richard confirmed. Sarah is my niece, but we only met 2 years ago. Then you really understand our happiness. We understand perfectly. After the family left, Sarah and Richard sat on the porch, processing the visit. You know what moves me the most about these stories, Sarah said. What? Knowing that every reunited family will lead to more reunions. Michael will tell his friends, and his friends will tell others. It's a ripple effect. And every young person who graduates from our vocational courses will inspire others to seek education. And every community that gets a center will serve as an example for others. We're creating a wave of positive change. Exactly. And it will continue long after we're gone. Richard was looking better and better. His latest medical tests confirmed his cancer was in complete remission. The doctors spoke of a cure, though regular checkups were still necessary. Richard, Sarah said, can I confess something? Of course. When you told me about the illness, I was devastated. I had just found my family and could already lose it. And now? Now I understand you're not going anywhere. Not while we still have so much work to do, so many families to reunite, so many young people to educate. Richard laughed. You know, Sarah, I used to be afraid of passing, afraid of leaving everything unfinished, of not having built anything lasting. And now I know we've built something that will last for generations, and that you'll keep taking care of it all with the same love and dedication. We'll keep taking care of it. Together. That's right. Together. 2 years after that conversation on the porch, the James Mitchell Foundation had become a national reference for family reunification and community development. It had centers in 12 cities across the Southwest and had expanded its services to include psychological support and microcredit programs. Sarah had become a respected figure in the non-profit sector, invited to give talks and consultations across the country. Richard had completely stepped away from traditional business and devoted himself entirely to the foundation. Look at this invitation, Sarah said, showing an official document. They want us to present our work model at Congress. Really? Richard looked at the invitation in surprise. This means our work is making a national impact. It means other regions of the country want to replicate our model. Should we accept? Of course. The more people learn about our work, the more families we can help. It was a particularly beautiful morning in the desert. The sun was rising, painting the sky in golden hues, and a gentle breeze softened the heat. Sarah, said Richard, watching the sunrise, can I tell you something? Always. Today marks exactly 3 years since I knocked on your door in desperation, running away from my own birthday party. Sarah smiled, remembering that night. I remember it like it was yesterday. A man in an expensive suit covered in dust asking for water. And you, suspicious as ever, still let me in. Good thing I did. Otherwise I would have missed the best thing that ever happened to me. What? Taking care of a stubborn uncle with cancer? No, Sarah laughed. Having a family again, having a purpose, knowing our lives make a difference for others. Richard stood up and hugged his niece. You know, Sarah, I spent 60 years of my life thinking success was about money and power. Now I know success is looking around and seeing all the lives we've touched for the better. And knowing we're not alone in the world. Exactly. We'll never be alone again. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with an email. It was from the center in Cactus Springs, announcing they had just reunited another family, a mother who had lost contact with her son 15 years ago. "Another family brought back together," she said, showing the message to Richard. "How many is that now? If I'm not mistaken, this makes family number 236. 236 families that wouldn't be together if not for our work. And if not for your father's wisdom, which brought us together first." They fell silent for a few minutes, reflecting on the magnitude of what they'd built together. "Richard," Sarah finally said, "thank you." "For what?" "For running away from your birthday party, for knocking on my door, for pulling me out of isolation, for showing me that family is the most important thing in the world. And thank you for letting me in, for taking care of me when I was sick, for showing me that money without love is worthless. I think we both learned the lessons we needed to learn. And now we can teach those lessons to others." Sarah looked out at the desert landscape, which 3 years ago had been just a refuge for her loneliness, and now was the heart of an operation changing lives across the Southwest. "You know what amazes me most about our story?" she said. "What?" "How a dust storm that could have just been an inconvenience turned into the most important moment of our lives." "How so?" "If the storm hadn't happened, you would have left the next day. I would have stayed suspicious, you would have gone back to New York City, and we never would have had the time to truly know each other." Richard thought about it. "You're right. The storm forced us to stay together, to talk, to share our stories. And it was during the storm that we found the chest with Dad's letters. And when we learned about your illness. And when we started dreaming of the foundation. So we can say that storm saved our lives. Literally." They laughed together, marveling at life's ironies. "Sarah," Richard said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy? Truly happy?" Sarah looked around, the simple but cozy adobe house, the serene desert view, the foundation papers scattered on the table, the loving presence of the uncle who had become like a father to her. "Yes, I am. Happier than I ever imagined I could be." She paused. "And you?" "Me too. For the first time in my life, I'm completely happy. Even with all the hardships, the illness, the radical life change. Especially because of them. They showed me what really matters. And they brought us to each other. Exactly." They spent the rest of the morning working on the foundation's expansion plans, but with a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led them there. In the afternoon, they received a call from Washington, D.C. confirming their presentation before Congress. It was an opportunity to show the entire country how the James Mitchell Foundation's model could be replicated in other regions. "Are you nervous?" Richard asked. "A little. It's a big responsibility to represent all the families we've helped. But it's a responsibility we take on together, and together we'll show that it's possible to turn pain into hope, isolation into community, and individual wealth into collective well-being." "Together," Sarah repeated, liking the sound of the word. "Always together." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, uncle and niece continued working side by side, building a legacy that honored James's memory and transformed lives across the country. What had begun as a desperate escape in the early hours of the morning had turned into the greatest adventure of their lives. The adventure of discovering that family isn't just blood, it's choice, that wealth isn't just money, it's human connections, and that it's never too late to start over, as long as you have the courage to open the door when life knocks. The end. And what about you, dear listener? What did you think of this story of reunion and transformation? Do you believe Sarah and Richard made the right decisions in leaving their old lives behind to build something new together? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us if you've ever experienced a similar family reunion. Your participation means so much to us. Don't forget to like this story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories like this one.